7 hours, 45 minutes, and 13 seconds it took for me to vote in Fulton County, Georgia. As soon as I saw the line, I hit the stopwatch on my phone. I spent the first couple hours listening to new Run the Jewels album, and then I ended up listening to the entire discography. And then I started watching season 8 of Curb Your Enthusiasm. That's 5 hours. It is 1 o'clock in the morning. Somebody was like, hey, y'all remember we came to vote yesterday, right?
Looking.
When it comes time to vote in November, would you rather stand in a line like this?
Somebody please help us. We are at our polling place in Atlanta, Fickett Elementary School. The systems are down.
Or like this?
Oh, look, there's no line. There's no line at all out here in what suburban white country.
7 years ago, a controversial Supreme Court ruling struck down a key part of the Voting Rights Act.
You hear me? The voting machines were not working.
And after that, many states passed laws that ended up making it harder for people of color to vote.
We have all these barriers that aren't in place for other people. It's 2020. Why is it this difficult for someone to go and vote?
To understand why, we go to Georgia.
I think Georgia has become a kind of hotbed for voting rights questions.
How voting takes place has become one of the most explosive issues in Georgia. Georgia is the largest state by landmass east of the Mississippi River. It's dominated by the reality of Atlanta. It's multicultural, it's dynamic, this sort of throbbing megalopolis where you're seeing Democrats in large numbers. And then beyond these urban centers, you have a much more traditional rural Georgia, where you have seen a massive shift of white voting behavior from conservative Democrat to full-on Republican.
Georgia has historically been a pretty conservative state, but as it becomes more culturally and racially diverse.
In this presidential election, there is some thought that Democrats have a shot here.
But one fact still remains.
Republicans control the state house, Republicans control the legislature, and they are free, frankly, to implement the voting laws they see fit.
As Republicans fight to remain in control of the state, some say it's no longer a fight over who people vote for, but who is allowed to vote. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, an independent federal agency, says these are the 5 most common voter suppression tactics. They happen across the country, but the only state that has ticked every box is Georgia.
The term voter suppression, embedded in that word is the very question of what the motivation is for these kinds of laws and procedures.
The Republican argument that they say is that they are worried about voter security. They are worried about voter fraud.
Voter fraud is all too common.
We don't have evidence of that.
And then they criticize us for saying that.
Federal law actually requires us to make sure that we keep our voter rolls updated, clean, fresh, and accurate.
Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger is Georgia's lead elections official. It's his job to maintain the state's voter lists.
Many people don't realize that nationwide, about 11% of all people move every year. And that's why you want to update your voter rolls. We just send notices out to people that haven't voted for a long period of time.
There's an argument to be made that purging voter rolls serves a legitimate purpose, and that is to make sure that people are alive. The counter-argument, of course, is that these rolls, voter rolls in some states are being aggressively purged by Republicans in an effort to keep them from coming to the polls.
In 2017, 560,000 voters were purged from Georgia's voter rolls. A report later found that black voters were purged at a higher rate in more than half of Georgia's counties.
This is happening in the context of the American South, where there is a long and well-documented history of using trickery.
Kind of Jim Crow era, things like poll taxes,
voting tests, literacy tests to keep people of color away from the polls.
You know, it's important to recognize that until the 1960s, African Americans were pretty much shut out of voting in the state of Georgia. That began to change when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965.
I think there is a need now for new legislation, a constitutional amendment
Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically says that states cannot make laws that infringe on people's rights to vote.
A key part of the law was something called Section 5 preclearance, which said
states with a history of racist legislation cannot make laws that infringe on people of color without the federal government's permission.
After the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, the number of African Americans who registered to vote in Georgia doubled.
It changed Southern politics.
At the most basic level, bigger participation from Black Americans.
And for a while, that's how things went. But
it's not as if the South loved the preclearance.
Many of the states felt it was an unfair burden, especially when voter participation increased.
What was true is that they frankly couldn't do much about it.
Well, until a challenge to the law brought the issue all the way to the Supreme Court.
On the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the Justices County versus Holder.
Shelby versus Holder.
I just get wound up when you ask me about voting rights.
Here to help explain is Debo Adegbile, the lawyer who argued that preclearance was still necessary.
This statute is in part about our march through history to keep promises that our Constitution says for too long were unmet.
The issue is why just in these states?
Justice Scalia, it's a fair question, and I was speaking to the aggregate.
Not just a fair one, it's the crucial question.
But the other side argued that the standards used to measure discriminatory voting practices were outdated.
We're here to challenge this formula because it speaks to old data. It isn't probative with respect to the kinds of discrimination that Congress was focusing on, and it is an inappropriate vehicle to sort out the sovereignty of individual states.
In a 5-4 decision, the justices ruled to strike down the preclearance, which effectively meant that states could pass new voting laws without federal oversight.
So it was a resounding loss and perhaps one of the most significant civil rights decisions of the United States Supreme Court in recent memory.
The decision of Shelby took away the federal government's most effective tool in regulating state voting rights.
After the Shelby decision, there were almost immediate attempts to change the way voting works.
Some states passed voting legislation just hours after the ruling. Alabama implemented new voter ID laws. North Carolina eliminated 7 days of early voting. And the list goes on.
Without the preclearance provision, there were many, many elections where those discriminatory laws affected our politics.
Voting rights advocates say this was a key ruling that had the power to impact the outcome of an election. And that's what many believe happened in Georgia in 2018.
The governor's race in Georgia in 2018 was
bitter.
On one side, you had...
I'm Stacey Abrams, and I'm running for governor. I have a boundless belief in Georgia's future.
Her strategy was based on signing up people of color. And then on the other side...
I'm Brian Kemp.
You're a proud, hardcore Trump conservative on spending, immigration, and guns.
So you had a Secretary of State who had come under criticism for voter suppression running the election that he's in.
As Secretary of State, I work to secure our elections and prevent illegal citizens or illegal immigrants from voting in Georgia.
So that puts them at odds.
We've seen jurisdictions consolidate and close precincts. We've seen voter ID laws come into play. There was a system in Georgia called Exact Match, where if your information doesn't 100% match databases that the state uses, that you can be purged from the voter rolls. That tends to target people with ethnic names. A lot of these new suppression schemes seem race neutral, but they have the same impact.
Georgia has 159 counties.
It's a staggering number of counties.
And we are hearing reports from all over the state.
There was a county in Georgia called Randolph County.
Randolph County tried to close 7 out of 9
out of the 9
polling places in a county that's 60% Black.
Jeff Davis County, polling location consolidations. I mean, I should say that, like, this could take a while.
Chatham County allowed the city of
Thunderbolt
to rejected several Fighting voter suppression is very much like fighting a hydra. You chop off one head and 3 grows in its place.
Here's one impact. The 2017 Exact Match law prevented 53,000 Georgians from having their registrations accepted. Nearly 70% were Black.
The evidence is very clear to us that the ones most impacted by these new laws are Black Georgians, are people in Democratic communities.
All of this results in a contested election. And then...
But I'm here tonight to tell you votes remain to be counted.
Make no mistake, the math is on our side to win this election.
So Brian Kemp squeaks out a victory.
And he is now the governor of Georgia. It was two figures who have represented the opposite sides of the voting rights argument.
The question that dogged Georgia throughout 2018 was whether or not these tactics were fundamentally fair.
So what happened in 2018 really is a preview where democracy is under a stress test.
One that may get even more stressed in the lead up to 2020, with the added elements of coronavirus and a country on edge after nationwide protests.
If you want change in America, go and register to vote. Show up at the polls on June 9th.
In April, in response to the pandemic, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger sent out absentee ballot applications to nearly 7 million registered voters in an attempt to reduce in-person voting.
And what that really has done is it's taken the pressure off of today. And so that instead of having those, million people that were voted absentee show up today, we now have something that is more manageable.
But many of those absentee ballots were never delivered. In Atlanta, this contributed to Election Day wait times that were reminiscent of 2018 and 2016.
We got here before 6 o'clock this morning.
Since 6 this morning. It's almost 9 a.m. and I have not moved.
In Fulton County, Georgia's largest, Election Director Rick Barron had to contend with both a 9,000% increase in absentee ballots and the rollout of a new voting machine system.
We became an absentee by mail state. We still had to do our full complement of Election Day infrastructure. We did our early voting infrastructure, and it stretched us.
With many usual polling sites like churches and schools dropping out because of the pandemic, an estimated 16,000 voters in Fulton County were redirected here to this restaurant, Park Tavern.
Take a look behind me. This is the Park Tavern precinct.
This polling place is serving multiple locations that are supposed to be separate locations.
And these problems stretched all across metro Atlanta.
The impact of having problems at the voting booth in high-density areas in Georgia means that people of color are going to be disproportionately affected.
One study showed that in communities where more than 90% of registered voters were minorities, the average minimum wait time at the polls was 51 minutes. When whites made up more than 90% of voters, it was just 6 minutes.
So how are things running now?
Well, by and large, they're running very smoothly throughout the state, except obviously Fulton County's had multiple failures.
Each county in Georgia runs its own election, with Georgia's Secretary of State as the top official. But after the massive failures in the primary, a blame game commenced.
They should be embarrassed with their performance.
Whatever Secretary Raffensperger's opinion is, he's the head election official in the state, and he can't wash his hands of all the responsibility.
In this environment, incompetence does have the effect of voter suppression.
Things would have looked different before the Shelby decision. Even in an emergency situation like the pandemic, the implementation of all of these changes, new voting machines, poll place closures, and the absentee balloting still would have required federal oversight through Section 5 preclearance. Meaning voters of color would have had
a front-end protection that stops discrimination before it can take root. What we've lost with the Shelby County ruling is that now when changes are made to take account of the public health crisis, they are not being made toward, are those changes harming minority voters?
Which means
your only option now is to go case by case, to try and find every bad thing that's happening and try and figure out if you can bring a case to stop it. That's costly. Litigation is slow. Can they happen quickly enough in proximity to an election to make a difference?
Voting rights and questions of voter suppression are not limited to the South. This is happening in Texas, in Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and other places. The political power of 1776 to 1960 was one that excluded huge communities of people in this country. And so history tells us the same thing that current day tells us. If you are black, brown in this country, to exercise your democratic rights is harder than if you are white. It's not just a foregone conclusion that everyone who is an American gets to vote.
You know, this is America. We can put a Tesla in space, but we can't vote. I mean, what do we think is going to happen in November?
This is Alex.
And I'm Cassie. We produced this episode of Stressed Elections.
There's a lot going on in this election, and we want to make sure we take a deep dive into the major issues. So stick around for the next episodes.
We're going to cover voting technology, disinformation, and voting by mail.